Hey there everyone, welcome back to Utility Sports. Super excited for this video as we're going to cover all 30 NBA teams in just one video as we talk about the cap space situation for each NBA franchise. And you might be saying, okay, what's the importance of this? First of all, free agency is right around the corner and is the draft, which means on draft night, some of these teams might be looking to use their draft assets to either open up cap space, to get off of a bad contract, maybe use some of the cap space that they actually have to take in some contracts in order to get extra draft compensation. So this video is going to lay out some of those potential scenarios, which teams to watch for most specifically, whether that comes to dumping salary, acquiring salary, and being aggressive as well in free agency. I think this video is just a perfect summation for some of the possible outcomes in this offseason. There's a lot of different things to cover, and I have another video coming out on the channel the day after this one comes out. So this one comes out on Friday, June 7th. On Saturday, June 8th, I'm going to have a video covering all of NBA free agency as well. So this video is a good precursor to give you an idea of where your team sits, what they could look to do in free agency as well. So this is a really good precursor video to the offseason, one that I think you guys are going to enjoy. So let's jump into it here now with the teams that have real cap space this offseason. And there's not a bunch of them, but there's a pretty decent amount, and there's a lot of actual cap space to work with as well this offseason, as 6 teams have actual cap space. The Detroit Pistons are the top of the list right now with $64.4 million in workable cap space. The 76ers not far behind though with $55.5 million of cap space themselves. The Orlando Magic have $49.5 million of cap space. The Utah Jazz with $38 million in cap space. The OKC Thunder have $35 million in cap space, and the San Antonio Spurs have a little bit over $21 million to work with this offseason. And I think my favorite thing about this is how different all of these situations are for these teams. For Detroit, with a new president of basketball operations in Trajan Langdon, they are in a spot where they need to add talent. They need to add veterans. They need to add players who are going to help them win. They could do that through free agency or through making trades. With the amount of cap space they have, they could definitely go out there and find a way to take in contracts. Someone like Zach LaVine of the Chicago Bulls, who might be a salary dump at this point. The Pistons have been rumored and linked to him in the past. I would not rule that out of the equation, but the Pistons with $64.4 million in cap space could go out into the market this offseason in free agency and actually look to improve their roster, very similar to what we saw Houston do last year as they kind of went into phase 2 of their rebuild of, instead of just accumulating top draft picks and tanking, they wanted to take a step forward toward winning. The Rockets were able to accomplish that this past year. The Pistons are now at that same exact point in time. They need to accomplish something. They need to start winning some actual games. They were just horrid this past year as they were the worst team in the NBA by record yet again. So Detroit, $64.4 million in cap space could go a long way in bringing them 1, 2, 3, 4 talented veteran players to fit around some of their young existing core nucleus in Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren most specifically, but they also have some other pieces off the bench. And they already started their shopping by bringing in Simone Fontecchio at the trade deadline, someone who fits their team pretty well. He's a restricted free agent and will likely be back in Detroit if I had to guess. So the Pistons have $64+ million to play with and a real opportunity to improve their team. Philadelphia has a completely stripped down roster. Tyrese Maxey's a restricted free agent. Joel Embiid's under contract. Paul Reed's under contract. But from there, it's basically a blank slate for the Philadelphia 76ers, and they have $55.5 million to work with. Now, one difficulty that the Sixers have that the Pistons don't have right now is having a max contract on their books with Joel Embiid, but with Tobias Harris likely gone and a bunch of other players headed toward unrestricted free agency, the Sixers have the ability this offseason to completely reshape their roster around Joel Embiid and Tyrese Maxey, who has a fairly favorable cap hold. They're going to be able to sign him as well. He's a restricted free agent, but they're going to be able to keep him long term as long as they don't rush to signing him. My assumption is his agent will not take any actual meetings either in order to not rush the clock on the Sixers, give them time this offseason in both the draft and free agency to acquire talent. and really get a third and fourth star. And then from there, they're going to fill out their roster with a bunch of minimum level players. I could see someone like Kyle Lowry coming back, Nick Batum staying around, Robert Covington staying around. So they'll retain their core nucleus of role players around a supposed big three, maybe big four, depending on how this offseason goes for Philadelphia. Orlando, nearly $50 million to work with. And they were already a playoff team, a team that I think accomplished a ton, got to a Game 7 in the first round of the playoffs this year. Really a very accelerated rebuild, and they've done a great job there. Orlando has just been brilliantly ran. Obviously, Paolo Banchero, first overall, was a great selection for them. Franz Wagner was a home run pick where they got him as well. The Magic have just done a lot of great things. They have some really nice defensive pieces too in Jalen Suggs, Jonathan Isaac, Wendell Carter Jr. Getting him in the Nikola Vucevic trade was great. Everything Orlando has done over the last 3-4 years has seemingly worked really well, but now's the time, in my opinion, to step on that accelerator a little bit. I'm not sure how active Orlando is going to be in free agency. They could be a dark horse team to watch for in some of the bigger name pursuits, but there are a lot of trade possibilities out there as well. Someone like Darius Garland, someone like Anthony Simons, I know Magic fans really like. Could they get involved with a DeJounte Murray or Trae Young sweepstakes? I don't think Trae Young's very likely for Orlando, but DeJounte Murray, someone who I think could fit the style there in Orlando, as well as functioning off of Banchero and Wagner as well. So Orlando, I think, is one of the biggest dark horses in the NBA right now because they got a very good young team. This is one of their last chances to step on the accelerator before having to extend Banchero and Wagner and Suggs and a bunch of their other young players to bigger contracts. This is one of their chances here to really drastically improve their overall roster, most likely by targeting a guard with some shot creation potential, something they just clearly did not have in the postseason this year. And I think an upgrade at the guard spot would be ginormous for Orlando and a really big step forward in the right direction for this organization. Then Utah at number 4. They have $38 million to work with. So, obviously we've talked a lot about free agency acquisitions. Detroit, it's about improving their roster. Philadelphia, it's about trying to get a third or fourth star on the roster. For Orlando, it's about finding a guard who can complement Banchero and Wagner. When we get to Utah, yes, they could theoretically go out and use that cap space to try and bring in talent. What I think is actually more likely for the Jazz is that they buy bad contracts. And what I mean by buying bad contracts is they're going to use their cap space, they're going to pay those players, but they're going to get incentivized by another team. So if someone wants to dump a contract, I think a great example of this is the Charlotte Hornets, who have Davis Bertans' $16 million player option to trade. Utah could look to absorb that type of contract in their books. So that's definitely something to watch for. OKC has worked that way a lot in the past. They definitely could still look to do that as well, although the Thunder very, very close to contention. So OKC, in contrast to Utah, who's a little bit earlier on in their rebuild, don't quite have the talent yet that OKC has. I think Utah is going to be all about acquiring more assets, acquiring more draft capital. Now, if there's a really good player out there that becomes available to them that they think they could get that fits around Markkanen, Walker Kessler, and the surrounding core of young players there in Utah, don't rule Danny Ainge out looking into that. But for the most part, I think that they will look to absorb salaries, absorb bad contracts, especially expiring contracts, and maybe they can net an extra first rounder, a couple second rounders, and really open up some more trade avenues for themselves down the road in that regard, as long as they're not taking in a 4-year contract or anything crazy like that. Then Oklahoma City here, $35.2 million to work with. Again, I could see them following that Sam Presti blueprint where they take in contracts. They did it last year, like I said, with Davis Bertans at the trade deadline, or on draft night, They were able to take in that contract and move up 2 spots in the draft from pick 12 to 10. That got them Case and Wallace, worked out very, very well for them. But also you look at the potential of them doing that again this year, where they're at pick 12. Cody Williams, if they really like him, could they jump up to 10? Could they jump up to 9 by eating a bad contract? Maybe, maybe not. So I'm not sure if OKC is going to look to operate that way again this year. There's also reports and rumors they could be in on some restricted free agents. Someone like Patrick Williams could make some sense. Obi Toppin would be an interesting acquisition for OKC. So they could go and actually use this cap space in free agency for someone who they're looking to pay between $15 to $20 million. Not too big of a contract, not something that's going to really limit them in the future, paying guys like Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams, of course. But I do think OKC could either step on the accelerator a little bit themselves, like we talked about with Orlando, or they could look to operate like Utah and continue building up assets to really not only just have extra picks to trade away, but to really stronghold and dominate the market. Every single trade it feels like OKC is involved in, and it's because a lot of teams need their help. Dallas needed their help at the trade deadline to land Daniel Gafford. OKC could really cement themselves as the middleman for a lot of teams and look to make profits out of that. So don't rule them out using some of that cap space for their own gain, as is the case for San Antonio as well. The Spurs, while I think that internally they're probably ready to win, especially with Victor Wembanyama's mindset being all in on winning, I think the Spurs front office and their management this offseason is not necessarily going to match that. They're not going to mirror that idea of pushing all your chips in, being aggressive, and trying to pay to win right now. I think they're going to slow play this, even though internally they probably feel like, hey, with Wembanyama going into a really great second year, probably where he takes another big step forward, it felt like every game this year he got better and better. Going into next year, he's going to be a monster, probably an all-NBA guy next season. So could San Antonio push their chips in and make the playoffs next year? They could, but I don't expect them to really do that. Maybe they'll make the playoffs anyway because of how good Wemby is. They have 2 picks in the top 10 this year. I think for the most part, they're going to slow play this, see if they can maybe get a couple of extra assets by eating a contract or two. We'll see what happens with the Spurs. But remember, last year they got involved in the Grant Williams sign and trade from the Celtics to the Mavericks. They took in Reggie Bullock at the time and got a 20-30 pick swap in that deal. So maybe the Spurs do something like that again, where they try to acquire more pick swaps. They try and get just more flexibility for future years, as they're going to likely be entering their prime with Victor Wembanyama in 3, 4, 5 years from now, which is crazy to think because he was so good as a rookie, but he's got a lot of room to grow yet, and he's going to be such a good player, honestly, such a dynamic, talented player. Then we get into one team that has potential cap space, and I already referenced them once in this video, but that is the Charlotte Hornets, who have $5.171 million in cap space. And they have a bunch of tradable contracts. You look at Davis Bertans, $16 million player option, so that's an expiring deal. You have Cody Martin just making a little bit over $8 million. He could be valued around the league. Look at Caleb Martin, who has a lot of value, likely this offseason as a free agent. Then Vasi Micic as well, someone who they acquired from Oklahoma City, just like they did with Davis Bertans at the trade deadline. Micic played pretty well for them, but if they were to move these 3 contracts and move them into other teams that have cap space, so if they traded, for example, Davis Bertans to San Antonio, they traded Cody Martin to Oklahoma City, and they trade Vasi Micic to Utah, for example, something like that, which honestly makes some sense for all the teams involved. Bertans goes back to San Antonio where he started his career. Cody Martin goes to Oklahoma City, brings a little bit of front court size, plays a little bit of a hybrid 3-4 for them. And Micic could go be a floor general guard for Utah off the bench probably. The Hornets could unload these salaries, probably doesn't cost them a ton, maybe a couple second-round picks. And they could open themselves up to having a lot of space this offseason. In fact, moving these 3 contracts gets you up to about $37 million, which gives you the avenue to maybe signing a max-level player. Or what I could really see Charlotte doing is replacing these 3 guys with players who they feel like are maybe better fits this free agency, guys who could be really complementary role players around Brandon Miller, LaMelo Ball. Obviously, they already have Grant Williams there. They have Mark Williams as well. Maybe finding a defensive-minded guard in free agency could make some sense. There's a few players that they could get with that $5 million cap space that they have as well. Someone like Chris Dunn from Utah could be a really good target for them too. So Charlotte has a bunch of different options out here in free agency and a bunch of different ways to open up some cap space. So we'll see what they do, but I think this is an interesting team to monitor between now and June 30th, which is the start of free agency. Then we get teams that are over the cap but below the brand new tax aprons, and this is important. So these teams, some of them have actual access to the room exception, which is going to be about $12.9 million this year, and they have access to the biannual exception as long as they did not use it last year. It's in the name, biannual exception. You get to use it once every 2 years, so they could have access to some ways of improving their roster. The Atlanta Hawks are a team that is actually really dangerously close to the aprons, but they do have guys that they could theoretically move depending on who they pick first overall. If it's Alex Sarr, maybe Clint Capella's gone. If it's someone like Zachary Sachet, maybe that means they find a way to move on from DeAndre Hunter. So there's some options here for Atlanta to move off of certain guys on their roster to maybe even free up some cap space for them financially. And then also DeJounte Murray could theoretically get traded. That's where trading him to a cap space team like Orlando makes a lot of sense for the Hawks from a salary release standpoint, as well as the assets you would get. Brooklyn, another team that is over the cap right now. And this is why this offseason is going to be such a crazy one of the best off seasons in recent memory, because there's a bunch of good free agents. There's a bunch of quality free agents that aren't max level players as well. It's a pretty good mid-level exception market this offseason. And you have all of these teams right now that have or are really close to the luxury tax, maybe even above the luxury tax. A bunch of these teams are. And what you could see is teams making trades to get below the tax, being very active to open up money for themselves in a bunch of different ways. Chicago, again, we talked about Levine possibly dumping somebody. Brooklyn, their new thought process there is building for longevity. So does Mikal Bridges get traded? Potentially. Cleveland obviously has a big dramatic offseason ahead of them, depending on the Garland-Mitchell rumors that we've been hearing. Mobley and Allen, will they keep that front court together? That's a big question. The Dallas Mavericks finally seem like they're in symphony. Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, their brilliance has really lifted that team this playoffs. Golden State, obviously a lot of questions there. Chris Paul has a non-guaranteed contract. He could become a free agent. We'll see what happens there. The Houston Rockets, also a team to keep our eyes on. They've obviously been very active, especially last year when they signed Dylan Brooks and Fred VanVleet. They made a push for Brook Lopez as well. They traded for Steven Adams this year, so they've already done a lot of their shopping, but they have picked three to work with. Are they a Mikal Bridges team? Very possibly. Indiana, obviously a team that's already made their big move in Pascal Siakam. They'll keep him. The Clippers could be one of the biggest disasters if they lose Paul George for nothing. That would obviously be very, very difficult to swallow. The Pelicans are in a spot too where they're kind of in a little bit of flux right now. We don't really know where the Pelicans are headed. Knicks, Blazers. The Blazers are one of the more fascinating ones as well. They have a bunch of trade chips. If you want to look at Malcolm Brogdon, who's becoming an expiring contract, Robert Williams, who'd have a lot of value around the league, Anthony Simons, I think, would be very valued by a bunch of teams looking to add a guard. And then also Jeremy Grant, who to me is not going to have too big of a market. He makes a ton of money. But the Blazers have four guys that I could really see them looking to trade. Sacramento is probably looking for improvements. They're going to lose Malik Monk more than likely this offseason, so they need to maybe be aggressive. There's rumors they'll use pick 13 in the trade market. Toronto, a team that has a tradable player in Bruce Brown. We'll talk about him more in a future video for sure. But the Raptors, very interesting spot. And then the Wizards, they didn't trade Tyus Jones. They could lose him for nothing this offseason. He is a free agent. But Washington's still at a spot where, with the second overall pick, they also have pick number 26, a bunch of second rounders over the next 7 years or so. Washington's really in the driver's seat after their quick rebuild. I think that they're at a spot now where it's about asset acquisition and talent upgrades. So there's a bunch of teams over the cap. There's a bunch of teams near or at the luxury tax already. So it's going to be a very active trade deadline or offseason in terms of trades probably, because not only do we have teams that are going to be motivated to dump salary, we have teams that would be motivated to take salary for an asset or two, and we also have a 2-day draft, which means draft picks are going to be a little bit longer on draft night. There's going to be more time per pick, which incentivizes teams to make more phone calls. And also, we have a 2-day draft, which again means that there's going to be a big layover between night 1 and night 2 of the draft, allowing teams to work the phones for roughly 20 hours or so before round 2 starts. So it's going to be an awesome offseason. A lot of these teams are going to be active, and some first apron teams are going to have to be active as well. The Lakers, Grizzlies, Heat, and Bucks are all teams that find themselves slated to be in the first apron as of right now, which is crazy because, again, we don't even have the offseason done yet. Some of these teams are going to be aggressive trying to add more talent to their rosters, which means even bigger paydays and even bigger tax bills. But if you look at the threshold here, these are teams that are committed to paying over $178.65 million this next season. They do have access to the taxpayer mid-level exception still at $5.22 million, but they would be hard capped if they do use that, which means you can't take in any excess salary from that point on besides minimum contracts. Not only would these teams get hard capped by using the taxpayer mid-level exception, they would also be hard capped when they're in the first apron by using the biannual exception, which is $4.7 million. We talked about that earlier. They would get hard capped by acquiring a player via sign and trade. Signing a buyout player who made more than the non-tax mid-level exception would also hard cap them. Then also using more than 100% in a salary matching trade. So if they were to dump salary and use the 110% rule that they can, it would hard cap them. So with the new CBA, we're going to see a lot of these teams find restrictions where they can't have the flexibility we're accustomed to seeing some of these high spending teams have, which means teams like the Lakers, Grizzlies, Heat, and Bucks, who none of them made it out of the first round this past year, they all have a lot of work to do in terms of getting their team toward title contention, but they don't have a lot of pathways of doing that. So this is going to be a very difficult offseason for all four of these teams, Now they all do have their own benefits. The Lakers going to get a new head coach. They also still have LeBron James. Presumably he's a free agent, so we'll see what happens. But then you also have pick number 17. Maybe you could add a center there or a guard who fits your roster. The Grizzlies have pick number 9, and they'll be healthy next year. I think the Grizzlies probably the safest team to bet on having a better year next year than any of these teams on the list. The Miami Heat, obviously they were banged up in the playoffs, as were the Milwaukee Bucks. So we didn't really get to see either of those teams at full strength in the postseason. But Miami and Milwaukee kind of set themselves up for danger with how their regular seasons went. Miami, again, another play-in season for them. Very disappointing, in my opinion, with how much talent they have, how good of a head coach they have. They need to start showing up in the regular season more consistently on a night-to-night basis, especially in the East. They should be a 3, 4, 5 seed pretty safely, pretty easily, and yet they have failed to do that 2 years in a row. And then Milwaukee, obviously, they finished as the 3rd seed, a lot of turmoil, fired their head coach after what honestly felt like a pretty disappointing start to the year. But then you look at how Doc Rivers did after taking over. The offense completely fell apart. He stopped playing their good offensive players altogether. Like Adrian Griffin was doing, their offense kind of reverted back to mediocre levels, and their defense never really ascended past mediocre levels. So these teams all have some real flaws on their roster right now, and it's going to be difficult to see them make upgrades. And when we look at some of these second apron teams, the Boston Celtics, Denver Nuggets, Minnesota Timberwolves, and Phoenix Suns. And there is one team on this list that is not like the others, and that is the Phoenix Suns, who are going to be very, very limited when it comes to trying to improve their roster. They don't have any of their draft picks. They're very, very old. Their team doesn't fit very well together. All of the things I was saying a year ago when Suns fans were telling me I was stupid, here we are now. The trade for Bradley Beal looks like a complete disaster, like I said it would be. The Phoenix Suns are just in a very, very tough spot, honestly. And with the threshold being over $189 million here for these second apron teams, they already have a lot of money committed. And the Suns, first of all, out of these teams aren't good. The Celtics are in the finals. The Timberwolves made the Western Conference Finals. The Nuggets were super close to making the Western Conference Finals. And honestly, the Nuggets were probably the favorites coming into the postseason, so you can't really fault them too much. Now, they didn't execute, get the job done. Faced a very tough Timberwolves team, obviously. But with these teams being in the second apron, here's what they can't do. They can't use the tax mid-level exception at all. So they're not going to be able to sign a player for more than the minimum, basically. They can't aggregate 2 or more players' salaries in a trade. So what that means here is you're not going to be able to trade 2 guys for 1. You're not going to be able to attach a $4 million salary and an $8 million salary to get up to a $12 million player. You can't do that anymore in the second apron. You can't send out cash in trades either. So someone like Phoenix, who Matt Ishbia has ran into the ground but thinks, oh, I'm super rich and smart, I can save everything. You can't attach cash to get a good player. You can't attach cash to get a second round pick anymore. Phoenix has really hurt themselves. They're in a spot where they're not going to be able to make any more trades because no one's going to have any interest in the assets that they do have, and they can't use cash as a backup option here. And then acquiring a player using a traded player exception that was created via a previous sign and trade. So they can't use that either. So basically all of these teams are in a very tough situation where they're not going to be able to add more talent. Now, luckily for Boston, Denver, and Minnesota, these teams are already very good. They probably don't have to add too much to their roster, maybe a couple small tweaks on the margins to really figure out where they want to go. For Minnesota, they're going to bet on internal development of some of their young guys like Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels. For Denver, it's about the 2-man game and being healthy at the right time, and maybe some of their young guys can take a step forward. Vlatko Chanchar, he returns and hopefully gives Denver a good boost of energy off the bench. And then Boston, well, they don't really need to change much. They're really, really good. And then when it comes to what these teams can do, they can resign their own free agents, obviously using bird rights. They're able to sign draft picks. Of course, the league would never take those rights away. They can sign players to minimum contracts, which, again, doesn't really do you too much good. I remember last year everyone telling me how smart Phoenix was for signing Keita Bates-Diop to a league minimum contract. Guess what? He didn't finish the year in Phoenix. So that's how those kind of contracts typically go. There's a reason they're playing for the minimum. So having minimum contracts all over your roster is not a good thing. And you can make trades where you send out one player and you could technically split your depth. So if somehow, some way, Phoenix found a way to trade Bradley Beal, which they're not going to be able to because he's on a no trade clause and no team's going to want his contract because it's ginormous, they could technically break him up into 2, 3, 4 players, just like what Washington did last offseason, but Phoenix is not going to be able to accomplish that likely at this point in time. So Boston, still, I think, one of the smartest teams, probably the best team in the league when it comes to overall roster construction and ideology in their roster balancing. Denver's right up there. Minnesota, I think, is a very good roster. Obviously, they went all in on Rudy Gobert, but I think it was the right step for them because they put Anthony Edwards in a lot of meaningful situations as a result of that trade. Phoenix, they were already in those moments with Mikal Bridges and Chris Paul and Devin Booker, and they completely reverse engineered it to the point where they got swept in the first round. So I think Phoenix is a lot of moves away, and I think they're in a pretty tough situation. But I do hope you guys enjoyed me covering all 30 NBA teams in this video, talking about all of the different cap space situations and how they're all uniquely impacted this offseason. I think it's going to be a very busy offseason. I think we're going to see a lot of crazy stuff go down. So if you guys did enjoy, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.